Previously on agentpalmer.com, a perfect pairing of extraordinary Canadians, McLuhan and Coupland. NASCAR Full Speed is fast fun, but will never pass Drive to Survive. And yes, Nick will be invited back on to talk about what he actually does for a living. This is the Palmer Files, episode 118, with Katherine Silva, who is a published author, an editor-in-chief of a small press, who writes horror, but with a mix of grief and existentialism, as opposed to just your slash 'em and bash 'em. We talk about writing, getting into horror, living in Maine, process, online communities, Anthony Bourdain, the DIY nature of independence, being workaholics, lists, balance, and much, much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 118th episode is Katherine Silva. Kat and I were strangers until this conversation, but there is a lot more that we have in common than just using words for our passions of creation, whatever those may be, meaning they aren't limited to anything. Kat is a one-person creative force with accolades and passion for the written word and publishing. Here in this conversation, you'll listen to us discuss the writing addiction, finding your community, being balanced or perhaps not, being workaholics, organization, lists, our internal monologues, horror misrepresentation, and much, much more. But before we dive in, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can find all related ways to contact my guest, Katherine Silva, and myself in the show notes. There you will also find links to Kat's site at katherinesilvaauthor.com. Don't forget you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and of course, email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. Now, sit back and imagine a scene that looks straight out of the Blair Witch Project. Black and white, grainy, probably a little cold, except that it's not. It's comfortable in a well-lit room, and while something nefarious may be going on in the subtext or our main characters, Kat and myself are relatively unaware of this evil spirit. However, the evil spirit is really only here to wreak havoc with Kat's audio, so we did the best we could. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Kat, you are into and around all things the written word. I know you're not exclusive to that, but you are a writer and a consultant and in charge of like associations and all things related to the written word. What's the one question you get from everybody when you tell them like I'm in publishing?
So I don't usually preface that I'm in publishing. Typically I'll say I'm a writer.
Okay.
And that elicits this response of like, you know, this very thrilled, like, ooh, so you're creative. And then from there it goes to, what do you write? And then as soon as I say I write horror, that's where people usually either go like, ugh, or go, oh, you mean like Stephen King?
Wait, okay, hold on. Even now, Stephen King is the go-to?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So it's Maine. Like, everybody here is still kind of a little behind the times, I guess. Or the people I interact with a lot of the time are not in the literary sphere as much. They're more just like everyday people. So they're very confused by the fact that the horror genre is a growing popular thing, because it really hasn't hit in Maine yet. And despite the fact that Stephen King is from Maine and is like the horror king.
Okay.
Yeah, it's weird. It's really weird.
I'm still horror adjacent. I'm not the biggest fan. Just in general, like the genre has never really grabbed me beyond Clive Barker. And I always say that makes me horror adjacent because I've look, I'm reading some of his horror stuff, but I started on his fantasy stuff, which indubitably has like horror elements. But I don't know. I come from the blockbuster generation of like, what cheesy horror movie can we put on? And yet somehow that never translated into the written word for me somehow. I don't know. I get teased about it all the time by friends I still talk to that we watched those horror movies and you didn't like it? I'm like, it was fun to hang out with everybody. It's just not my bag. But I think everybody kind of, I'm going to make a blatant statement because why not? I feel like everybody kind of comes to horror around like between 10 and 16, always too young. And your reaction to that first taste, it's almost like the most important reaction you're going to have to a genre. You can come back to fantasy. You can come back to science fiction. If horror doesn't intrigue you on some level, no matter how much it scares you, you're probably not going to come back.
Yeah, that's fair. I think there is a lot of misrepresentation around what horror is.
Okay.
And a lot of the time, people do just kind of throw the blanket statement on it, which is that it has to be, something Clive Barkery. It has to be something Stephen King. And it's a pretty wide scope. There's a lot of different subgenres within horror. I tend to write a more nuanced, moody horror, not necessarily the like buckets of blood, gore, slasher kind of stuff, or even like splatter punk, which is pretty popular right now.
So for my reference, which is pretty poor at best, Dead Alive, which I guess would have been Brain Dead originally from Peter Jackson. People consider that horror. I consider that comedy. But it's got a lot of blood and gore. Like, but that's, is that kind of in that vein of what you're talking about where it's like people consider that horror, even though like I'm sitting here going like, that's not horror.
So I haven't seen it.
Okay.
But from what you said, I would probably say it falls into comedic horror, which is definitely a thing.
Okay. All right. Well, what got you into, I don't even want to say horror, but just like writing in general, because you also, those other things, the editor, the consultant, also, I think I saw somewhere you blog on, I blog on a weekly basis, but you blog on what seems like a monthly basis, which I give you credit for because not a lot of people take the time with that art form. But you are putting pen to paper on a regular basis in lots of ways. Where does it start?
Well, it started when I was a kid, and before I could even write, I was doing picture books. Just, they were lots of pictures of dogs making friends, basically, but it was a story. And so I would draw these pictures in sequence and then staple them together and make little books. And that was kind of where it started. And then in second or third grade, my mom encouraged me to do this Reading Rainbow Young Story Writers contest thing. And I put together a book for that and submitted it, and didn't win anything, but I have this very lovely little plaque on my wall from having entered that, and a signed thing from LeVar Burton, which is pretty cool. And from there, it just kind of like stuck with me that I wanted to tell stories, and I wrote weird little stories about haunted houses and witches and scarecrows and things like that. And then about middle school, I discovered the desire to write longer stuff. So I started writing novels and completed my first novel freshman year of high school. And it was bad. It was very bad. It was about a thief who is also a professional piano player who goes to a house and tries to steal an ancient sword, and it just was like off in another land. But I came back to my horror roots after high school, after graduating high school, and that's when I started writing horror more.
Okay. And like I was fishing, by the way, because when I tell people that I'm a blogger, they go, "How do you make money at that?" And so and I try and avoid the subject at all costs because, you know, you got a podcast too. Yeah, you making any money at that? And think, no. So like I try and avoid it, but at the same time, I'm curious when I meet other people who are creative because not every, you know, we define ourselves by what we want to do. Like, you know, everybody likes to talk about different kinds of identities, especially as we've gotten in the last maybe decade. And I don't know, I'm not defined by my work, but I like to think that some of the creative work I do defines me, but that doesn't make me money. And so therefore, when people are like, "Well, what do you do?" We're like, "Well, I have a blog and a podcast." And like, "Well, how do you make money?" It's like, "Well, that's not why I do it." But like, it inevitably comes up. Everybody always wants to know how you make money at it. You've obviously sold some books. And obviously you've done some other stuff, but like, and maybe in a smaller bubble in Maine, it's not that big of a deal, but like, do people ask you, do people bother you about like, well, you know, or like, are your parents like, maybe you should get a real job? Like those things, which we've all been through, by the way. It's not. Yeah.
You can't really be an indie horror author and not have a day job.
Okay.
It's unless you're really, really lucky. That's just not how it goes. So I do have a day job, and I have worked the same day job for the last, 17 years.
Wow.
So that I can fund my horror writing addiction. And really, it all works out because, you know, I'm able to take the time off that I'd like to go to book shows and do readings and book signings and things like that. And it just works.
So I have to ask this question. I've talked to other writers, not just related to horror, but many writers call it an addiction. I am not a writer that's afflicted as such. I very much have a love-hate relationship with my keyboard and my pen and paper. However, I'm a blogger, and whether it's 500 or 50,000 words, I'm telling one story, and I'm in and I'm out, and I get to celebrate on a weekly basis that I published something. So I get to fall in and out of love with it all the time. Is the addiction as the word I'm focusing on here, is that a part of what keeps you engaged in long-term projects? Like, does it need to be an addiction to follow through on that?
It does. I've had several projects where I've started something and I've gotten, 40 pages into it and I've been really cranking on it, and then I just lose the spark. And I can't get it back for whatever reason. I've tried, I put it in a drawer and leave it for a while, and then I'll come back to it and try and write it, and it's just not going. So if I start a project, it's got to really sing to me, okay. And I've got to really be invested in it. And it's typically the characters more than it is plot or anything else. If I can really get into characters' heads and really feel them and really vibe with them, then that's usually what pulls me through a project.
Do you get to celebrate in between? Like, I mean, as using the word addiction makes it seem like you finish one and move right on to the next. Like, do you take time to celebrate in between?
Yes. So as a self-published author, you are burdened with doing all of your own marketing as well. And so it's really, you're not necessarily like stopping one thing and moving on to the next thing. You are spending a whole lot of time with this one project, because as soon as you move out of the creative phase and move into the marketing phase, you're like, okay, now I have to make other people like what I like. How do I do this? And then you go through the motions of doing all of the, interior layout, cover design, sending it to an editor who then tells you all the things they didn't like about it so that you can fix those things. And then sending it out to your early blurbers who tell you all the things that they hopefully like about it. And it's a whole thing. I discovered last year that it is very easily possible to go too deep into that abyss and lose yourself into it. So I'm at a point where I'm trying a new thing, and I'm going to try and publish with some other small presses and take a break from the self-publishing because of that wormhole. But yeah, the long story short, you always do end up spending a lot more time with a project past the creative process.
Yeah, I mean, that makes I don't envy authors or musicians for that matter that have when you talk about an independent, it's really not just a lack of label or publisher support. It's really just like, well, I mean, if you want to do this the right way, it's time for you to do everything. And there is there, I don't know in my background. I know where I picked up the pen, right? Like I was on a science track until a really good 7th grade English teacher was like, opened my eyes to the arts. And now all of a sudden I want to be a writer and I don't want to be a scientist or an engineer anymore. But like the DIY stuff, learning about websites, learning about, I did the interior design and layout for my buddy's book of poetry, which I also edited. And all of this stuff comes from, general education, but it's a DIY mentality that presumably, as I'm thinking about it right now, comes from just being a geek and a nerd and being interested in things and going like, I'll try anything. Sure. Like whatever. But is there a start to your DIY? Because obviously you have to have some of that or none of this works. It's just like, well, I wrote a thing. Oh, I'm done now. Like you have to learn how to do the rest of it yourself. Like where'd that come from?
My first book that I self-published was in 2010. And I did not know what I was doing. I did it through a publishing group that helps you self-publish things here in Maine. They were just getting going, so it was kind of new for them too. And really, there was not a lot of teaching on the marketing, like how to market your own stuff then. So I was just kind of thinking like, oh, cool, I wrote this awesome thing. I put it out there. People are going to read it and it's going to do really well. And it did not do well. It did not go anywhere because nobody was marketing it. I didn't know what I was doing. And it was part one of a series. So the next book came, I wrote that. I did everything myself because at that point I was thinking, I have to learn how to do this at some point. So I'm going to create my own cover, which was rough. And I'm going to do my own layout and all this stuff. And it was all rough. It was all just really rough. But I was proud of myself at the same time.
Sure.
And only years later, looking back at it now, can I look at it and be like, ooh, like that needed some refinement. And you learn that stuff. You realize that when stuff doesn't sell, why it doesn't sell. Like, yes, the interior layout needed to be better. The cover needed to be better. You actually needed to like market it. And it took me a lot longer than it probably should have to realize these things. And I had to kind of do a whole reboot and reintroduce myself, start marketing with a fresh book, and really try and like put myself out there in more ways than I had previously, which meant getting on all the social media sites, you know, doing it all. I had joined Twitter back in 2011, I think, and I didn't do anything with it. And things definitely changed once I got ramping up on that. I was introduced to a whole community of people that was really supportive and awesome, and having that community is so integral to getting anywhere. I think I mean, you can try and do it alone, but it's really not the same without friends and peers and networking, which is really important.
Yeah,
so that's a lot of it.
It's been very encouraging and scary are the two words that come to mind. To hear you and other authors I've talked to talk about the online creative spaces, communities, Discord servers, whatever, and how like they're wonderland, but you have to stumble into it or like you have to find it first. It's always rocky. It's not just rocky going at it on your own. It's rocky until you find that community. And that's the scary part, because like not all writing communities are equal. Not all horror communities are equal. Not all podcasting. Like, you have to find not only the community, but the right community for you or for your project. You can have multiple communities, and it's just like, that's the scary part. It's like, there's so much, how do I find it? And sometimes it's a lot of networking, and it's a lot of, pardon the pun, kissing a lot of frogs. But like eventually you find the place where everybody's like cool and, you know, supportive. And that's not to say the other ones aren't, but, you know, for whatever you're trying to do. And then all of a sudden it's magical, and it's like, I can ask a question and get an answer. Oh my God.
Yeah. And that's like, it took me 10 years before I found my community. So, and that's a lot of that is probably because I didn't start searching until years after. I should have been doing more sooner, but yeah.
Now, are you in your personal life with like your friend group? Are you also surrounded by other creatives, or are like you the creative?
So we're gonna put that in quotes, friend group, okay. Because a lot of my friend group in real life has withered and spread out.
Okay.
And that's just kind of like, it's Maine. The cold months of the year, no one does anything. Everybody like just stays inside their little hovels and exists in the cold. and then summer comes and you kind of like come out and sort of do some socialization and whatever. But mainly my friends that I consider close, I would say are creative, but not in the same vein. They're crafty, they're artistic, but they're not necessarily into writing per se.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I'm surrounded by a few creative people too that are, my buddy's a poet and a writer. I don't want to pigeonhole him. He has at least drafted a novel that I did a pass on that has sat on the shelf ever since. And I'll bring it up on this podcast every chance I get, hoping that one day he'll listen and be like, maybe we should pull that back down from the shelf. And this is my platform and I can do that. But like the other people that I know that are like artists, at minimum, we can cross mediums and at B's like, I'm really having trouble here trying to get through this paragraph. And they're like, yeah, and I'm really having trouble drawing this thing. And at the very least, there's some overlap there. But writing is such a unique animal that I'm so glad I have writers to talk to. And I don't know how you would have done it in those 10 years where you were, I don't want to say floundering, but just alone. That seems scary to, I think I've always had other writers I could, I don't want to say lean on, but I guess complain to with someone who's listening and understands what it's like to have writer's block.
Yeah.
I don't understand. How did you survive for 10 years on your own?
Well, I mean, I wasn't on my own. I do have a lot of close friends in the writing community. Okay. And the 10 years, I would say I had friends and I had acquaintances, and I could certainly reach out to those acquaintances and friends and talk to them about things. And then, and a lot of the time I had, I could talk to my best friends about things too. And they weren't writers, but they would still understand what I was going through. And then as of late, I found some really, really good friends in the horror writing community that I can talk to. And I can, of course, talk to my partner in crime about stuff too. And he can sort of give me some good feedback, which is needed as well.
I want to go back because I will be remiss and I'll kick myself if I don't ask this. Is Maine one of those places where like once you hit 16, 17, 18, all you can think about is leaving Maine? Is that fairly accurate?
I think it was accurate 10 years ago.
Okay.
I think now there is a lot of desire for people to be in Maine, and that's very post-pandemic because everybody wants to be out of cities. They want to be somewhere where it's kind of rustic and old-fashioned and quaint, I guess. And Maine exhibits all of those facets. And there's a pretty big literary community in Maine now. So there's a lot of writers moving to Maine too. So it is an interesting change.
I guess I've been to Maine. I'm in Pennsylvania. So like I've been to Maine and it's way up there. And I only bring that up because like if I was going to leave the city, I don't know I would go that far. Maybe that's a personal thing. Maybe I'm just practical and like maybe I shouldn't be days from the city. That's just
like I get it. It's not for everybody. It has its things which some people really like, which is it has the ocean, it has the mountains. It's a really good combination of beautiful scenery and it's also just different it's very different than your typical big city vibe.
Gotcha.
But you can still get to the city if you want to. It's not that far away. You know, places like Portland and Boston are still close by.
Okay.
So I think there's that.
I mean, do you mind the winters?
I mean, they've become less snowy and more just gross rain and ice over the last few years. So I don't like them.
Okay.
If they were snowier and there was a little more, you know, to do outside to enjoy the outdoors a little bit more, I'd like it better.
Yeah, I mean I have a partner who loves the snow, and she moved in with me. And we've had like 3 snowfalls in like 6 years, right? Like substantial, not like, oh, it's a dusting. And so I mean, I get it. It sucks. Winter in the Northeast, from me all the way up to you, should not be 40 and rainy. That's for spring and fall. That's not winter.
Yep.
All right. So I wanna take a left turn here. When you're not writing and you're not working to write, do you are you reading? Are you watching? Like, what are you consuming in your downtime to just step away from the screen, step away from the keyboard and the pen and paper?
So a lot of my reading material is horror novels. It's just, I read a lot of other people's work because I like to support my fellow authors, and I like to study other people's stuff.
Sure.
You know, I like to see what other people are doing that I'm not doing. I like to see what's popular. It's, when I read, it's not just like fun time. It is, a lot of it is work also, which makes me a workaholic. And so that's work and enjoyment. But also I think my TV watching is a little more enjoyable because it's not necessarily horror all the time. We have been rewatching a lot of things, and they're more in the comedy world, just because it's so different, and it's nice to have some levity to all the dark stuff. So we've probably rewatched I Think You Should Leave like 4 or 5 times, because Tim Robinson is a genius, and then Detroiters we've now rewatched twice. And I'm working my way through Stanley Tucci's Italy,
the travel
series.
Stuff. Okay.
Because I love Stanley Tucci and I love food series, and that just is a lot of fun to me.
So I interject here because contrary to what people may think, I do a little bit of homework, and I saw one name on your about page that like stuck out to me more than any other. And it's because I think at the time I read Kitchen Confidential, I'm burying the lead for people who don't know, but at the time I read Kitchen Confidential, I think it may have been the fastest I ever consumed book. Until Ready Player One, that I consumed in like one sitting when it, but what Anthony Bourdain does in Kitchen Confidential and then A Cook's Tour, in describing the complex simply and describing the simple in complexity, but yet still making it enjoyable. It's not like a philosophy book, but it's going to make you think. It is. I know he was pretty brilliant on No Reservations too, but those two books, I want to say might be perfect. And I mean, I'm a reader. Okay. I read a lot of different things, a lot of, and I haven't, kind of delved. I know he wrote at least one nonfiction and I haven't read it. But those two, specifically A Kitchen Confidential, but like A Cook's Tour was, I think more authors need to read him.
Yeah, I agree. I read Kitchen Confidential several years ago, and it's because I had watched No Reservations, which I loved. And Anthony Bourdain has like the coolest voice for writing. He's just so raw. Like, he doesn't hold back anything. It's just, he just lays it all out. And I love that. And I want to write like that. I want to bring that to the page. And I haven't done it. That would be an end goal for me. But he also just did a lot of traveling. He had a really wide scope of everything.
Now, did you have any kitchen experience when you read Kitchen Confidential?
No.
Okay, because
I mean, did not.
I wouldn't call this kitchen experience, but I worked in fast food for like 4 or 5 years in high school and college. And like, I wouldn't even call myself a line cook at that point. Like, I could work a fryer, but like, I stupidly related to that book on so many extra levels that I want to ask, like, what was the relatability if you hadn't spent time in a kitchen of any kind? Because it to me, that book specifically, like, it spoke to me. I was like, oh, so I'm not alone.
Yeah, I think it's less about the industry and more about the fact that I tend to be a workaholic no matter what it is. Okay. So losing yourself in your work is definitely something that I have not been able to relate to anybody else about in my particular industry. And so when I read a book about somebody who was a workaholic, such as Anthony Bourdain was, and then it became his passion, it just, it did speak to me. I could see through the industry and straight to the person that he was. And it continues to inspire me. I started rereading it not that long ago. It's just,
how do you manage anything if you're a workaholic when you have a day job and a passion project? Like, where's your balance come from? I ask this question as a person who is also a workaholic. Like, if I don't know that it was a choice, and I don't know if this is relatable to those out there listening, but like, I can watch a movie, I can watch a few episodes of a television show, and I can read a book. But if I'm not doing anything of any of those things, if I'm not actively consuming something, I feel like I'm wasting my morning, my afternoon, and my evening. I need to be editing this, researching this, drafting something else, or collecting my, I could probably be promoting all of this more because we could all do that better. Like, but I feel like I always need to be doing something. It's not so much that I'm a a workaholic. It's just that I'm always thinking of like, oh, you should probably, like, my internal monologue's like, what, slacker? What do you got so much stuff to do. That's my workaholic. It's just me battling my internal monologue that calls me a slacker.
I have a very similar internal monologue. Like today, for example, I've been fighting a headache all day, and I took a nap for an hour, and I ended up sleeping for 2 hours because I didn't mean to, and I woke up and it was like, well, my entire afternoon is gone. What did you get done? Nothing. But at the same time, I'm also on this kick of like knowing how the marketing of my last book absolutely destroyed my mental health last year. I know that I need to be better about self-care. So I am definitely on a kick to make sure that I do not do too much too fast.
Okay.
So it is about making lists. It's about scheduling things. I have this giant Post-it pad of paper on my wall behind me, which is, I've got it sectioned out with all the different months of this year and then divided in half by like, what am I doing as an author this year? What am I doing as a small press this year? So that I've got it broken down month by month, and I'm not like trying to kill myself doing too much too quick.
Okay, so this is in regards to making lists. How good are you, and balance specifically, how good are you at estimating workload? Because there are times when I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do these 6 things tomorrow, or like over my morning coffee, I'll be like, I'm going to try and get these 6 things done today. And like sometimes by lunch, I've gotten all 6 done and I'm like, this is amazing. And sometimes it's 10 o'clock at night and I'm halfway through the first one because I'm just really bad at estimating sometimes. And I have no rhyme or reason why these 2 6-item lists are just so different. Because in my head, when I'm making the list, I don't think this is going to be half the day and this is going to take weeks. How are you as far as judging that when you're going month and week?
So on a grand scale, when I'm making lists like this one, I'm pretty good.
Okay.
If it's a thing that I have a whole month to do, I'm pretty good. If it's my Thursday checklist of things to do, which I do have on my phone, I am so bad at it.
Okay.
There are probably 20 things on that list that I have to do. And really what it is like, some of those things are just things that I haven't done that need to be done around the house.
Sure.
And that could happen Thursday. It could happen Sunday. But if I could get it done on Thursday, that'd be awesome. If I can check off at least 2 things on my list for Thursday, I'm happy. And you know what's on that? What's on the list for things to get done are things like have a cup of coffee and take a shower. So I set the bar really, really low,
okay.
So that it makes me feel better. And honestly, that helps. Just in terms of like, if I'm having a really rough day, physically, mentally, whatever, I know that I'm not going to get 5 or 6 things done on this list. It's not going to happen. If I'm having a really great day, sometimes I'll get like 10 things done on the list. But I like to keep it easy for myself. I like to keep it so that it's like, it's possible to do these things, but it's not like, it's not going to happen necessarily. And I keep the list, and sometimes I change it based on what things have changed, and I'll check things off on the list, and then the next Thursday I'll get rid of all the check marks and start over. But yeah, that really helps.
I I think I should probably do it on a more regular basis, but like every once in a while I'll be like, I think it's time to consolidate all the lists. And for me, that's generally speaking, a bunch of notepads, a few digital ones, and like a Google Doc where I'm like, all right, time to put them all together and see what I didn't do for the last 3 months. And sometimes it's like, oh, I did this. I just never marked it off, which is wonderful. And the rest of the time it's like, I don't know what this means, which, I think happens to all of us list makers where it's like, I don't know, that I'm sure that meant something to me at the time. I don't know. I wish I could just throw them away. I don't know if it's really good to try and consolidate the lists like I do, but I'm making attempts. Because the balance thing is really very much like right now I'm a consultant, which is a fancy word for saying some people pay me, but I can't get a real job. And that's fine. And I have no problem with that. But one of the things that I've done is it also means I have a lot more daylight to do this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I've very much tried to stop at 5. I'm just going to hang out with my partner. She's got a real job. So I'm going to hang out with her from 5 on. And I'll try and start work at 9. I'll try and pretend I've got a 40-hour-a-week gig. Between what I get paid for and my passion stuff, because I remember what it was like to have a 40-hour and come home and record and edit and write. And it's like, I'm okay doing that again. I think I would actually relish the idea of doing that again. I think it's underrated how much creative people need something else to fill the time, because all we will do is think about those other things, either the things that aren't done or the project that's kind of been stewing that you just haven't started yet. Whatever it is, like we're generally speaking, all of these things, and you've said things tonight where like I just nod along. Like, yeah, I see you. I've been there. I'm the whole stopping at 5 is not really like it. It is real balance. It's like, oh no, like I don't have to work 12 hours on a project on a Saturday. Like 4 hours is fine. And then I can have friends and a life and do other things. I'm making attempts. I don't know how. I can only say my mental health can only be worse than it is right now. I think it's okay. And I think I think people I love the idea that you're, working on self-care and balance, because like marketing's not easy. If it was easy, anybody could do it. But I think marketing your own thing is maybe the hardest thing you'll ever do. Mm-hmm. How are you as far as the balance of like, and I'm going to pull a number out of my hat, but like, maybe like you're supposed to promote yourself 5 times a day. I don't know anybody who's comfortable promoting themselves 5 times a day. So how are you as far as balance in that regard of like, I shared the link twice. I don't want to overdo it.
Yeah. I mean, I've learned that self-promotion is not about saying like, buy my stuff and then sending a link 5 times a day. It's really not what it is at all. If anything, what I used to try and do was I would post every day on all of my social media platforms. And I do still have every single one.
Okay.
So that means
that's a lot of time. Is that like an
online.
hour?
Yeah.
That at least an hour every day, probably?
It's a long time.
Okay.
Yeah. It's, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, TikTok. And at some point, I just pretty much over the last 2 months realized that I can't do that anymore. Especially since I don't have any projects that I'm openly promoting. I'm not in the middle of, I don't have a book that I'm releasing anytime soon. I'm working on something new. Really all it is just making sure that people, one, know that I'm still alive and there. And two, talking about the thing that I'm working on so that it sounds at least interesting and people go, oh yeah, that's the thing you were working on, when it does start to ramp up eventually. So I'm trying to pick up my posts on TikTok right now, because that is a really good platform for engagement, as much as I hate the idea of filming myself. And then I think it's between like Twitter, Threads, and Blue Sky. I post those three a little more often than some of the other social media platforms because my engagement is better on those. And that's really it. And the posts there are things like, I wrote a really sad scene today, or, I'm commenting on somebody else's thing, whatever it is, as long as you're doing something, you're interacting with other people, that's all that matters.
Talking with Kat about Anthony Bourdain was not only delightful, it has since got me thinking about what other authors or voices exist which are not given their due. The late and great Anthony Bourdain was often pigeonholed in food and travel when he really gave voice to culture and humanity, a scope much more broad than just food and travel. What authors are dismissed because of their genre or topic, who deserve more than they get? You can let me know, but I would wager Kat is in a genre with horror where brilliance is often written off because of the genre. This is why it's important to get out of your comfort zone, read and watch some things you wouldn't normally consider, and see what's good and brilliant that is beyond your current media library. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files episode 118. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can find all related ways to contact my guest, Katherine Silva, and myself in the show notes. There you can find more information about Kat and their work at katherinesilvaauthor.com. The music for this episode was provided by Henno Heitur. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. All right, Kat, do you have one final question for me?
Yes. How long did you work in the food industry, and what was your favorite thing about it?
So I worked at a now defunct fast food chain called Arthur Treacher's. And I was there throughout high school and college. So I want to say 5 years. Ironically, I stopped working there when the store closed. Like they shut our franchise down, which was the beginning of the end for the brand as a whole. If I would love to tell you that it was great getting free food. And I would love to tell you that the hush puppies were the best hush puppies I've ever had. And they were, so that's not a lie, but I have to say it was the people. It was genuinely, I had the same assistant manager and an assistant manager who became manager for like my entire time. When I started, they were both assistant managers, and then one got moved up. And I think it was those people. I was a 17-year-old, 16, 17-year-old punk. They were in their around 30, plus or minus 4 years in any direction. I have, when you're 17, anybody over 20 is old. Okay. So they could have been 36. They could have been 27. I have no idea. But like, just, they treated me like an equal. And we hung out around work, but not just at work. And so it was the people, it was the crew. It really was. And so I know everybody, like, I also worked in retail for 7 years. So like when I go out to eat, when I go out to shop, like I remember what a bad day was like. I'm really willing to wait as long as it takes to get my food, or for you to ring me up or whatever. Like I'm never going to be a problem for anybody in the service at retail, at food industries. But, I am one of those people that, like, I think I got lucky that, like, I was with a cool crew of people that were just kind of fun to be around, and we could make up games and we could talk about stuff and just whatever. But, not everybody has that experience. There are some people who are like, I hated every moment of it. And I understand that too, but I just got lucky. But it was just, I enjoyed being on the fryer. I didn't have to talk to customers. I didn't have to deal with any of that stuff. It's, I didn't mind the scars. I don't have any more, by the way. They didn't actually permanently scar me, just for a summer or whatever, like that. That dropped a lot of grease on my arm, like whatever. But that was it. It was, I wouldn't say it was formative necessarily, despite the fact that it's changed the way I treat service industry people, but I guess in that way it was formative. But it was just late nights and sometimes early mornings, and you got to do inventory, and you learn all about it. It is probably the first time I ever really saw a business run. And holy crap, like, it was like, oh, I think in hindsight, it was the first time I ever realized that the people running things were so far removed from the people doing the things. And in our case, it was our manager was with us and in the trenches every day. But the person who ran the business was like a regional supervisor or whatever. I don't remember, but like, they make decisions and they're not there. And I think as a lesson in what would later become a theme that I would learn in other places, like, that was a very important early lesson to learn. But yeah, I mean, it was really fun. Just, we closed at 10 most of the time during the year, and at 9:45 you'd drop a little extra fish or chicken in, and I think we're getting a rush, and then you'd be like, I'm not going to throw this out, but we did close the door, so I'm going to take this home.
Yeah.
So, little stuff like that, but I honestly, it's one of the few jobs I would trade in my retail experience. I would give that back in a heartbeat. But my Arthur Teresa's experience, I would keep. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't sexy. But I mean, I wouldn't trade that for anything.